to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Today we wish to discuss with you the subject of the Middle East. It's on everyone's mind, and it's a very crisis-oriented time for us. And we're fortunate to have on the program a man who is very capable of doing that. We welcome to the program Dr. Meir Hornston. He is a physician here in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, but he has a wealth of experience that qualifies him to discuss this subject. Our guest holds a bachelor's degree in the field of arts from the University of Pennsylvania. He also has his degree as a physician from the College of Osteopath in Des Moines. He has also done advanced work at the University of Michigan and Thomas Jefferson Medical School in Philadelphia. Dr. Hornston, it's a pleasure to have you on our program.
Thank you, Tony. Nice to be here.
And it's also the fact that our guest has spent 2 years in Israel as a kidney specialist, where he learned so much about the Middle East, and that's why he was invited to the program. And as always, I'm very happy to welcome Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and she shall commence our questioning.
Dr. Hornston, to begin and set the stage for our viewing audience, can you tell us why did you go to the Middle East, and then what did you do once you got there?
It was at a time in my life, Janelle, when I wanted to explore my roots further. I had gone through a divorce, and since we had no dependents, I, in a sense, had the freedom to go abroad. I had visited Israel before and was enthralled by its beauty and by the opportunity I had to really see my roots and the roots of so much history. And I went there as a new immigrant, packed up all my belongings, stored about 20 cans of tennis balls, and took other items that would be very expensive to buy in Israel, and set out on what I considered an adventure. I had really no pre-planned timetable as to how long I would stay, and it would just be a question of weighing the pluses against the minuses. Initially, as a new immigrant, I was housed in a dormitory type facility, which they call an absorption center, and stayed there for 5 months. It was the first time in my life, having grown up back east, that I had an opportunity to understand what brotherhood and international relations was all about. Because in the dorm where I lived, there were people from Russia, new immigrants that had come over. There were people from South America and people fleeing from Rhodesia and South Africa, as well as some Romanians. I mean, we just had the United Nations all there, and it taught me the importance of communication, in that I spoke very feeble Hebrew, and I sort of felt like I was a second grader trying to converse with these adults. And it was a hard experience, because 6 days a week, 4.5 hours a day, we learned the Hebrew language, and by being at the center, it afforded us an opportunity to make contacts as far as jobs once we would complete the basic language program, and also they had people to help with housing. There'd be particularly problems for large families, and I was fortunate I had my choice of positions as a kidney specialist, a nephrologist, if you will, and wound up having 2 great experiences in the hospital where once again, I found out that patients were patients no matter where they were in the world. If they had high blood pressure, they too didn't want to take their medicine all the time, or complained about certain medicines not tasting too well. But I really enjoyed it, and had a chance to live and learn another language and discover, of course, my own roots.
Okay, now moving along into the area then of the culture of the Middle East, what did you find that is different about that culture than our culture, or what can help us to understand what's going on in the Middle East? What about their culture?
When you consider that Israel was only founded in 1948, and that this country has been going on since 1776, you can appreciate how far Israel has come in 42 odd years or so. That it's been a survival battle for them from day to day, from the time back in 48 when the country was formed up to today, in terms of the Arab threat that has been ever so prevalent. So that people think that Israel is in a state of war and that everyone's walking around and doing their shopping with guns. It's not true. There is certain security measures, just as you would in any major town. I think Coeur d'Alene is a relatively safe area, but having lived in Chicago, for instance, there's certain areas of town I would not go to no matter what time of day or night it was. So too would be true in Israel. But by and large, there was very little crime there, though it's been appreciably increasing. I think our Western influence from some of the television programs and the violence has carried over into Israel. But though there may be robberies, things like that, very few violent crimes of murder or bodily harm like that. But the people go about their business, and it's a hard life there. That sounds like a trite expression, but it's true, having been there as a tourist with my credit card in my pocket and able to go and say, just see the good times of it. Having worked there as a physician, it was a 6-day-a-week job, not only for me, but for everyone. We just had off Saturday for the Sabbath. Sunday morning was back to work again, and the wages that I made, just to give you some idea, this was, mind you, 77, 79, because the doctors, for the most part, work for one of the unions, that we would go in just like the UAW workers or longshoremen, and we had representatives, and there'd be contract negotiations. But because if one group of individuals, say the engineers, got a raise, then the teachers would want a raise, and you'd have a domino effect. So the government was trying to stifle inflation, which then was running, I believe, a couple 100%, astronomical values. We talk about 3-4% here in this country. There it was in the hundreds. That they would give you a basic wage that might be real low, but to try to compensate, they would give you perks. So there would be a perk for being on call, perk for being on call for a holiday, perk for driving your car up and back. And I was only making like $12,000 as an acting department head. And anything over $600 a month, I had to pay 60% taxes, most of which goes to their defense needs, which are, as most Americans I think realize, extremely high because of the constant threat that they have. So that people are working hard, they're heavily taxed, and yet there's a common thread of uniting them, the fact that they're Jews. They're Jews there from this country, from all over the world, and it's been a haven, which I think when you watch some of these films about the Holocaust, you realize that there was no place for the Jews to go, and that the sad stories of people on boats that had fled Nazi Germany not being granted admission to this country, to many other countries throughout the world, and ultimately dying, that you can appreciate the fact that there is a place where Jews from the world over can seek refuge.
We want to get into some of the issues with this very good background you've given concerning the controversies that have been going on in the Middle East for a very long time, and which has emerged in the most recent crisis with Iraq invading Kuwait. But let's talk a little bit about the West Bank, because we hear so much about that, and you certainly have a real good familiarity with that issue. We hear so often the Palestinians are demanding that there be a resolution of the problem with the West Bank, and I know with the Camp David agreements that an awful lot of land was given back to Egypt. I think about 85% of the territory that we're talking about. Just describe to us how you perceive the West Bank issue.
For many people that aren't familiar with it, the West Bank predominantly is an area that surrounds the middle of the country around Jerusalem. And Israel, to keep things in perspective, is approximately the size of the state of New Jersey. I think probably in the last month more Americans have had maps of the Middle East, and they take a close look. It's that Israel is that little dot just at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. You take a look at how big Saudi Arabia is, and Iraq and Syria, and here you've got this little New Jersey-sized state in there. The whole width of the country is approximately 50 miles. And Tel Aviv, of course, is on the Mediterranean. Jerusalem, about 50 miles or so inland. And a large part of the area surrounding Jerusalem is the West Bank. Cities such as Ramallah, for instance, Jericho are predominantly Arab-settled areas. And you're talking maybe 10, 15 miles beyond Jerusalem are very large Arab cities. And the breakout of the war in '48, there were several attempts to try to partition the area into a part of the country for Israel, part of the country for the Palestinians, and the thinking was that why negotiate when the Arabs thought they could annihilate Israel? Because Israel wanted to sit down and have peace. There had been Arabs living there. Of course, there had been Jewish people living there for hundreds of years. And as things worked out with the eventual War of '48 and subsequent wars, particularly the the Sinai War in '67, Israel was attacked by Jordan. Up to that point, Jordan had sort of just been a quiet neighbor that was not provoking anyone. They provoked the war. Israel went in, took back part of Jerusalem that had been off limits to them from the '48 war. Jordan had never allowed access to any of the Jewish holy places. And suddenly Israel went and as we know, in that 6-day blitz, they conquered a lot of the Sinai Desert, portions of the Golan Heights, which is the northern area going into Syria. And suddenly the whole clamor has been, well, what do we do with these refugees? The Palestinians, they want their homeland. If we take a look at refugee problems worldwide, or even from the state of the refugees coming into Israel now, the country and world Jewry is providing money to try to resettle those people. It seems that the Arab countries, at least those in power, have allowed those refugees to remain in squalid refugee camps. Rather, with all the resources that they have, particularly the Arab oil-rich countries, could have resettled them into other areas and seen that they got educated, but they've opted not to do that. They've just allowed those people to stay there, and United Nations efforts as well as Israeli efforts have tried to help out, but it's just as though they've become martyrs against Israel, holding Israel responsible for their rather deplorable condition when there's been no effort to resettle them. There was a war and one party won and one party lost, and it's as simple as that. But the fact that those hundreds of thousands of people remain there has put Israel between a rock and a hard place. And what I mean by that is that, believe me, Israel does not want to be an oppressor. Knowing what freedom means and the fact that it's so indigenous to the Jewish faith, they don't want those people to be, in a sense, maintained in those camps. They'd like them to go and live their own way. And yet, we've seen the last month or so just how radical and how fractionated the Arab cause is. The rallying point had been, well, if Israel gives back the West Bank, everything will be peaches and cream in the Middle East. Unfortunately, the feelings and the hatred run so much deeper than that, Tony, because of the fact that we see, if we take a look now, as we have recently, at these governments, there are really no democratic Arab countries. King Hussein is sitting there. He's afraid to make any move, King Hussein of Jordan, in that most of his country is made up of Palestinians. Saudi Arabia is a feudal monarchy controlled by a couple hundred princes. Iraq, of course, we know what kind of a dictator he has. Syria is almost a step beneath them. Let's not overlook all the terrorism that they've caused. So that because of this proximity, which I wanted to tie in, I've stood in the West Bank, and you can see the outskirts of Jerusalem. So it'd be like staying here on the North Idaho campus and saying that in Spokane we're going to have armed troops there that have sworn to our destruction. Suddenly it's a different perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I want to follow that up in relation to Iraq, because that's what's really got everyone's attention. And President Saddam Hussein has really demonstrated that he's not only a dictator in his own country, but he has real ambitions, it appears, to rule all of the Middle East and control the world's production of petroleum for countries like Japan. If he gets in that position, then of course the world would be at his mercy and the other industrial countries. And he obviously invaded Kuwait. And what I want to get to is how this affects Israel. And I know Israel has been very cautious in this process because many of the Arab countries are also siding against Iraq at this time. I guess I have a two-part question. First of all is that President Saddam Hussein is also wanting to have nuclear weapons. In the early 80s, Israel bombed a site that we thought was developing those, and he's on that road again. So my question, very involved, is number one, what must we do to prevent that from happening? And number two, how can Israel work in this very delicate situation at this time?
I think that Israel has the nuclear capability themselves. They've often said they've not, in a sense, actually denied the fact that they have nuclear capability, but they say that they'll not be the first country to use that, and I believe it, because we're talking a potential nuclear war that could just destroy the entire world, just about. They've tried to remain out of the spotlight because it's really not their problem right now. Kuwait, an independent country, was invaded. I think that Saddam didn't figure on this type of resistance, and he bit off a lot more than he can chew. He's backed himself into a corner. I think his pride will not let him go out without losing face, which is a very strong condition in the Middle East, both among Israelis and I think even more so about Arabs. Losing face is tantamount to probably just about the worst thing imaginable. So that Saddam has been trying to get Israel involved and make it a question of, you return the West Bank to us and we'll pull out from Kuwait. But Israel has kept to the sidelines, I think rightfully so, because his invasion has nothing to do with the West Bank. That's a whole other historical issue.
But hasn't he also tried to use that to bring the Arab countries on his side and make it a Arab-Israeli issue?
Yeah, he has, and I think actually what's happened, it's actually discredited the whole in Fatah, the Palestinian uprising. It's discredited that whole issue because they've come out in favor of Saddam, despite the fact that most of the established Arab world, including the major country being, of course, Egypt, as well as Syria, Saudi Arabia, the backbone of the Middle East on the Arab side has come out against him. And here the people that have been in favor of the PLO and all these other radical groups are waving banners, yay Saddam, and it's sort of discrediting their uprising, which has really not changed much. But the fact that the whole effort at peace, I think indicative of the difficulty in that is you have moderate Palestinians, and they want to have any meaningful dialogue with Israel. What happens to them? They're assassinated. Unless you have a hardline radical group, that's okay. But if someone wants to really establish some dialogue, and there have been a lot of grassroots efforts to do that, it gets squashed by the assassination attempts.
Janelle Berg.
Doctor, what is your idea in terms of the United States? I know that you have lived here as well. Why do you think the United States is so interested in the Middle East, and what position makes the United States want to be involved in that part of the world?
I think it's twofold. I think number one is the question of the oil. If Saudi Arabia didn't have the oil reserves that it does, then I don't think we would give that much of a concern about it, because why didn't we respond to the tragedies in Afghanistan? Why didn't we in '56 respond to the pleas for help in Hungary, or more recently when Czechoslovakia was being suppressed? It's oil, it's power, it's political power as well, because though our relations have improved considerably with Russia, we had I think a mindset that if we let a vacuum develop in the Middle East, that Russia would fill that, and that's all, of course, changed now, because that confrontation has cooled. Russia is, I think, fighting for its own survival as a country, exhibited by the shortages of basic commodities there. But to let Iraq get away with this move would give them about 40% of the world's oil supply, and that's a no-no. We have cheap oil in this country. I've lived in Israel, as we've mentioned, and had to pay, I think then it was $2.50 or $2.75 a gallon for gas, and you were a lot more conservative in just taking joyrides when you have to pay so much for it. Because you could say, well, why are American boys there? What are we protecting? What loyalty do we owe Saudi Arabia? I don't think we owe the princes much. I think we're looking out for our own welfare, and our welfare is tied to oil. Look at the repercussions now. Prices are going up. We had a recession coming on. Oil costs, this morning's paper spoke of possibly hitting $2 a gallon, and it ripples through the economy. Airlines are going to charge more. Expenses for heating oil is going up, and it has a very sinister effect on our well-being. Certainly it's not a threat here. Grenada, for that matter, wasn't a threat to us. So you could say, and sometimes we take this foreign policy because that serves our best needs. Other times we'll tolerate a Fidel Castro, right? 90 miles off the shore of Miami. That's okay. A little tiny harmless country like Grenada, we wanted to flex some of our muscles, and we did that.
So you're saying basically economics is one reason and political reasons are other reasons.
Right. I think that a vacuum would exist. I think it would also set a precedent. We keep going back to the days of appeasement as far as World War II and allowing Hitler to do that. Iraq has a formidable army. There's no question about that. It's perhaps not as powerful as might be expected, in that some of their equipment is antiquated. To our country, a life is very sacred. I don't think there's the same kind of feeling abroad, because here for 7-8 years, Iran and Iraq were going tete-a-tete, killing one another, and Iraq, to gain political strength, was all of a sudden willing to bury the hatchet with Iran and say, oh, buddy, we need your support. Here's this passageway, this waterway back for your support.
Kuwait was the same thing. Kuwait was very supportive of Iraq during their war with Iran, and then they got turned on them. Yeah. It seems like that what we read about Saddam is that he is, unlike Khomeini, he is not doing it for religious reasons. He's not Khomeini was so absorbed in that all rationality had disappeared. He's a very pragmatic man, but let me give you a scenario and see how you react to this. Suppose the world pressure, which I think it very likely could do, would force Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. And then he sits back quietly for 3 to 5 years, and he does develop nuclear potential. Even though that appears to be a victory, the fact that he is withdrawn, if he does, isn't the danger just been prolonged?
I think you're absolutely right. The big question is not only, of course, the nuclear problem, but that of the germ and chemical warfare. We're talking here a very barbaric type of warfare against all the recognized forms of government, of civility in the world, and yet I could see easily. I doubt that he's going to survive, Tony. I think that I love to read spy novels and you sort of project. I've got to believe that there's going to be some sort of a coup, even though he apparently has a very loyal group of officers close to him, some sort of a coup to get rid of him. Because Israel, from my understanding of it, will not, by any means, if they feel threatened by that, I don't think they'd hesitate to do what they have to do, or even for that matter, the United States. Let's not forget that we went in and bombed Libya after we had had our fill of it, and that the whole scenario of terrorism itself has not been resolved. That's taken a back burner, but let's say we get over this acute episode, we still have to deal with that. The fact that at any one time some of these individuals, these radical groups, could get a hold of some nuclear weapons, hold countries, the world hostage, that it almost reads like a fiction. If we go back 10 years ago, it would have made an excellent fiction reading. But he could hold the group hostage even right now with, say, the 80 Americans that are supposedly dispersed to armament or key airports as protection against their being bombed. This man is unscrupulous. And I think that were it to come down to a question of life or death, Israel or for that matter, the United States would do what it had to do, and that might be actually preempting and bombing him. We just have one more point. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force was asked to resign because he tipped the hand as to this very point.
It's very frustrating with the short time we have on the program, but there's two other points I think that are really, really significant here. One of them is a positive one. With the crisis that we've had in the Middle East before over the years, the danger was heightened with the fact that the United States tended to have one position, the Soviet Union another one, and they both would rush to the Middle East, and they were confronting one another as two nuclear powers. The positive note is that with the great developments that are taking place in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, we don't face that kind of situation as we have in the past. Does that make it more possible for a solution when one particular country that might be, for example, antagonistic to Israel cannot now depend upon the Soviet Union for support?
I think it makes things a lot easier because it's no longer we versus them, the United States versus Russia. And Russia is too busy right now for its own survival to really get that involved. But in modern times, I don't think, with the exception of World War II, that we've seen such a unified front by and large from the Western countries. France, which is usually used to doing its own thing and thumbing its nose at the rest of the world, they had their fill when their embassy was invaded. And they've taken a greater stance. The only countries that really surprised me from not being more involved is West Germany and Japan, certainly the latter from an economic support. They've given a few billions of dollars, but we hear it said that we don't want the United States to become mercenaries there because we are protecting that oil, which, for instance, Japan gets a lot of.
I only interrupt just to say, because of lack of time, that even if we become energy independent and we don't need anything from the Middle East, but if we do not become involved in the Middle East and then they make Japan and West Germany, others, captive of what they want to do, there still could be a world depression. So we can't be isolated from that, can we?
The world is too small for that. Our economy, insofar as even trade and all, is so integrated today. Japan, West Germany, United States. It's no longer a question that we have this huge ocean that separates us and that protects us, because we're as vulnerable economically as we are geographically.
Yeah, that's why I was speaking of if Japan and Germany and others were to collapse economically, there's a real effect for us. The isolation is no longer possible.
The isolation isn't possible, but I think that in trying to get our own fiscal house in order, how the budget meetings going on, which have been unresolved, and the deadline of October 1st coming up, we don't have the money and the resources to continue this war, which is going to be very costly.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. We'll have to have you back at some other time. You've been most informative, and Janelle Burke and I both thank you for your presentation and answering our questions.
Thank you, Tony.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've enjoyed our program. I'm sure you have, and I invite you to be with us again next week at this same time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.